It's time for politics. Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast with your host, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to talk about election predictions. So, we're in the home stretch of the presidential election season for 2024. And in such a home stretch, or the home stretch for any major election, you're going to see increasing attention paid to these predictions of their results. Which presidential candidate is going to win Nevada or North Carolina? How about who's going to win the governor's race in Washington, for example? So many statewide elections or U.S. House district elections are seen as clearly favoring either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. Others are seen as moderately competitive, but probably leaning towards somebody else. Some are seen as probably leaning towards this other candidate, but it's anybody's game. And then others are considered complete toss-ups, where who knows who's going to win those elections. But how can forecasters be so sure about a lot of these contests and other ones not be so sure about them? How do they come up with these conclusions? Well, today, that's what we're going to talk about. So it makes sense to first start off with big name forecasters and their formulas. Organizational examples include the Cook Political Report, Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball. He is a professor at the University of Virginia and runs the Center for Politics, or maybe he doesn't run it anymore, but I believe he still does. Inside Elections with Nathan Gonzalez, C Analysis, Split Ticket, Elections Daily, and these forecasters have both free and paid content explaining the reasoning for some of these races. They don't necessarily say that this party is going to win X state or X district in the US House. They just say how likely it is that that will happen, although they may say in their more detailed explanation for why they make these ratings, they might say this candidate basically has it in the bag. Then there are individual examples like Nate Silver and Alan Lichtman. Silver was a statistician who founded the website 538, which blogged about statistics and polling, sports, and other topics. Since then, Silver is left and 538 has ceased operations. Lichtman is a history professor at American University over in Washington, D.C., and he has correctly predicted 9 of the last 10 elections, except for 2000, which was a pretty wacky election. So these forecasters don't necessarily share their exact formulas. They're not going to say, okay, we put this much weight on this factor over here, we put less weight on. They're not going to necessarily share those kinds of things, but they might be more open about what their formulas are. So, for example, Lichtman even had a book that details 13 keys to presidential elections, and they include both objective and subjective factors like economic predictors and a candidate's charisma. Candidate charisma is kind of more of the subjective factor, even though some people you could just tell they just have that charisma. Whether you like them or you don't like them, that's not the point. And for Lichtman's formula, if 8 or more keys are true for the incumbent party, that incumbent will win the election. Technically, Kamala Harris is not the incumbent, Joe Biden is, but it's the incumbent party. So in this case, Democratic Party is the incumbent for the presidential election. If she has 8+ keys favoring her, then she should win the election. And Lichtman has come out and said that he believes Kamala Harris is going to win this election. So we'll see how that works out. But there's general agreement between the forecasters on most federal contests and even governor's contests too. Typically, you see this in the what are considered the safe seats for Democrats or the safe seats for Republicans. A little bit more variation in the more competitive elections that are going on. Some people might see something as a toss-up. Others see it slightly favoring the Republican Party or slightly favoring the Democratic Party. But you see far fewer predictions made for the state level. Governor is an exception, but you don't really see it for elections such as attorney general or auditors and treasurers, and you don't see it very often for state house or state senate. An exception in that regard is C Analysis, And the reason why is, well, there's more coverage and attention paid to these federal elections and governor, not so much all these other state level elections, and certainly not for local races. And these factors for these state level offices are often much more obscure and or less available for certain state level contests, such as for state senate. But you do see them every once in a while. But the predictions are primarily going to pertain to U.S. House, U.S. Senate, President, and Governor. Now, as for these levels of competitiveness, you see some similar terminology and levels of distinction. The exact criteria for how to determine how likely the Democrat or Republican is to win a contest, again, that's just depends on the predictor. And then the actual naming convention for these is also a little bit different too. So, for example, inside elections has the toss up, then there's a tilt, then there's a lean, then there's likely, and then there's solid. Others like Larry Sabato, I believe, Larry Sabato uses the designation of safe instead of solid, but it basically means the same thing. So it's useful to think of levels of competitiveness in terms of numerical levels. So a level 0 would be a toss up. Who knows who's going to win this election? Level 1 is slightly favoring the Democratic or Republican Party. Level 2 is there's a fair chance that the Democrat or Republican are going to win, but they don't have it in the bag. And level 3 is this is basically a foregone conclusion. Now, C analysis and inside elections have more tiers than the other election forecasters do. But if you're going to compare between Hooks and Sabato and inside elections, C analysis and split ticket and elections daily, you can kind of think of it in those terms, those numerical levels 0, 1, 2, 3, level 1 Republican, level 1 Democrat, that sort of thing. So, what are the kinds of factors that we look for when we're making these predictions? So, there's a whole host of factors, and some forecasters put more weight on some factors versus others. Some may include factors that the others don't. Again, we don't necessarily know the exact formulas that these predictors do, and some of them are more open about how exactly they do it, but they'll still have content where they talk about this has become a more likely Democratic race, or this has become a more likely Republican race because of XYZ reasons. And you're going to see that a lot more as we approach the November election. And these factors include both objective and subjective aspects. And then, of course, you've also got short term and long term forces. Short term being those economic factors like unemployment or wages, long term being previous electoral history, both for individual voters and for overall contests. So, how has have these voters voted in the past, and how have these overall elections played out in previous iterations? So, let's go take a deep dive into some of these specific factors. Not necessarily a comprehensive list, but just an assortment of some of the really big ones that are going to be considered when you make these predictions. First factor, previous history of the same election's results. History is one of, if not the strongest indicator of who wins the next election. So we're taking a specific contest like a governor in Maryland or Washington, we said before, Kansas, whatever the case may be. If one party is consistently winning that contest and they're winning it handily, they'll probably win it again. For example, Democrats have won 9 straight U.S. Senate races in Michigan, but the margins have decreased in each of the last 4 times. 2020 was very close. It was within 2 percentage points. Percentage points being, if you look at the numbers, there were 2 points between them. So, for example, if the first candidate or the winning candidate won 46%, and then the second place candidate won 44%. That's a 2 percentage point difference. But big swings in margins of victory are possible. You don't necessarily see them that often, but it could happen. But generally speaking, if one party's just winning over and over and over again, and it's not even close, and over time the margins of victory haven't been getting closer, probably going to be won by that same party again. Now, what if it's a race that can happen in both midterm and presidential election years? Why is that even important? So we're talking namely US Senate and US House, because US House is 2-year terms, US Senate is 6-year terms. The reason why is you want to compare similar years for that contest to see the most similar turnouts. Presidential election turnouts are more similar to other presidential elections, and midterm election turnouts are more similar to midterm elections. It's not that you can't compare the two, but you might want to base your prediction a bit more on, in this case, let's talk about 2024 being a presidential election. If you're talking about a US Senate race that is happening, if a US Senate election happened in, I can't remember for certain if it's actually happening this year, but let's say Oklahoma, uh, and it also happened in 2020. You may want to compare those two as opposed to if another state's US Senate election is going to be happening this year, and then it had another US Senate election in 2022. Just because a lot of these presidential election voters do not come out for a midterm election. They're strictly presidential election voting. So again, it's not that you can't compare the two, but if you're basing presidential election forecasts or presidential election year forecasts, so not necessarily presidential election, but ones happening in a presidential election year, and you're basing it on a midterm elections results, it's not that you can't do that, but you got to take it with a big grain of salt. Next factor, primary result turnout. So primaries already get much lower turnout than a general election does. But if the primary turnout for one party is particularly lower than the other party in terms of turnout rates, so there's 30% Republicans that come out, but only 15% Democrats, that may be a bad sign for that disadvantaged party. Or if it's higher primary turnout overall, probably going to mean more turnout for that general election. And if that one party is higher in primary turnout than they usually are, that might indicate that that party is more energized. And you also got to account for in an election if there's more Republicans or if there's more Democrats. So even if one party has a particularly high rate of turnout, let's say Republicans have 15, no, let's say they have 25% turnout and Democrats have 15% turnout, but there's like a million more Democrats in whatever district or state than there are Republicans, that difference in turnout rate might not matter because of the sheer number of sheer advantage that Democrats have in total number of voters. Same thing if it was Republicans who had the advantage in total numbers. Now, there is some debate as to whether higher turnout elections favor Democrats. The fact is, most Democratic voter demographics tend to be given toward lower voter turnout. Republicans are typically whiter, they're typically higher income. Those are associated with higher rates of turnout. But what's debatable is that if all else is equal, if overall turnout is higher, Democrats benefit. That's the idea. Some people still operate on that assumption. So if they see that there's higher turnout overall in a primary, they might suspect that the Democrat has an advantage. Again, that's assuming that all else is equal, like if there's an equal number of Republicans and Democrats. Rarely plays out like that, rarely is so clean. But that idea that higher turnout rates, that they favor Democrats overall, that's still a debate. Next factor, polling. So there's lots of misunderstanding about what polls really are and how they work. A poll is a sample estimating overall support for a candidate or ballot measured in a snapshot in time. Because polls are a sample of the population, it is not a perfect representation of the overall population because you can't get everybody's opinion on a candidate or a ballot measure. And for some people, their opinion might change over time. But mathematically, what may seem like a small sample size to the general population can actually be mathematically representative. It's a whole formula that I won't bog you down with, but as much as 1,000 people in a state can actually be a mathematically representative sample. Now, you also see what are called margins of error. Not really explained what these are, but these are based on a statistical concept that we call a confidence interval. So we can't be 100% confident about the sample's results being completely representative of the population. Generally representative, closely representative, but not fully representative because you don't know what the overall population believes. You would have to poll the entire population to do that. So, what's really being said is let's say that a candidate has 45% support and the margin of error is 3%. So, the idea is the percentage of the population supporting candidate A is going to be between 42 to 48%. But there's still an outside chance that maybe 49% of people support that candidate or 50% of people support that candidate. So what's really being said, depending on what the confidence interval is, and don't need to go too far into that, but typically you see confidence intervals of 95 and 99% statistically. So what you're really saying is we are 95% confident that the percentage of the population that supports candidate A or ballot measure, whichever, is between 42% and 48%. So it's most likely going to be in that range, but there's still an outside chance that is not the case. And again, things can change over time, so you have to account for that. And then oftentimes a sample is treated as monolithic by media headlines and regular people. We also want to know what specific demographic subgroups are. For example, what do black voters think? What do female voters think? What do evangelical white males think? Specifically, we need to know those kinds of things as well because certain demographics are more predisposed to vote for another candidate. For example, black voters overwhelmingly vote Democrat. If support for a Democratic candidate by the black population is lower than we would expect, that Democrat might have some trouble. Depends on other factors like how many Democrats and how many Republicans or Democratic and Republican voters can vote in that race. But if support from a demographic subgroup is lower or higher than expected, that can change how much or what exactly that poll might be telling us. The media rarely looks beyond the surface level stats, and if they do, there isn't much depth. Though, in fairness, lots of media consumers aren't that interested in that really nitty gritty detail, and media only has so much time to cover these things. They can't just devote 5-10 minutes to a poll necessarily. They got to move on to the next topic of discussion. Now, that said, not every poll is worthwhile. Media often treats every poll as valuable, or biased media outlets who are clearly one side or the other. They often like to cherry pick polls that are favorable to their candidates. Not always. Sometimes they will point out polls that are not favorable to their candidate. And there's even been instances of purely fake polls getting traction. It's not very common, but you do see it every once in a while. Back in 2016, I believe, Debbie Stabenow, believe there was a poll regarding her election that said Kid Rock had more support, theoretical support. He didn't actually declare his candidacy for that race, but he theoretically had more support than Debbie Stabenow did. Problem is that poll was completely made up. They didn't actually, they I forget the exact details, but the group that did the poll was not real, and they didn't actually poll anybody, but they gained traction. So you got to look out for that. You got to make sure that there are reputable resources or polling firms that have been around for a while and have been fairly accurate in the past. It's not very often that you see false polls, but every once in a while it does come up. And there also have been some struggles for polling in recent years. For example, increasing non-response rates. So non-response is you try to make contact with a respondent. The way we get samples is we randomly select people based on we might have their phone numbers or or whatever way we have to contact them. You randomly select them. You don't look at one and go, we're going to pick this one. That biases the sample. Being random makes it so that it's very likely to be a representative sample. So non-responses are where you try to make contact with a respondent, but they, for whatever reason, don't connect. Maybe they just don't want to talk to you and they tell you that. Maybe you don't even get a hold of them at all. And that can bias the sample because the pool of potential respondents gets smaller and it really messes with the random nature of the sample. So, and those non-respondents, a lot of them are going to be voting in that election. So you're not necessarily getting their opinion, and that might slant the results. Also, polls are getting increasingly more expensive. More questions is a higher cost, especially when you have higher quality polls. Higher quality also costs more. Ideally, you would want to be able to pick people's brains about all these different aspects of the election, but you only have so much time, so much money, so much manpower, people actually working for that firm. Respondents don't want to sit there all day and answer questions. So, more respondents is also more costly, especially if you keep getting non responses because it's just more time. So, polling has also had that lately, but high quality polling is incredibly important for these campaigns. Now, what are ideal measures for a poll? So, for population, because of the way statistics work, at least 1,000 respondents is a pretty good sized poll. Obviously, you'd like more if you can. Lower is not necessarily a bad thing, though. It just depends on what the election is. But 1,000 respondents tends to be a pretty good number of people. Just if you actually dive into the statistical procedures, it turns out 1,000 is actually a pretty good sample, even for a really big population. Margin of error, you're usually looking for 3 to 5%. If it's higher than that, it's probably a little, I don't know if we want to really, not necessarily that those aren't useful, but you want that 3 to 5% range. And then you want each demographic subgroup being represented proportionally if you want to know multiple demographics' opinions. Now, if there is a little bit of difference in, so for example, if you have a sample where the overall population of Hispanics in whatever state it is 25%, and that state is having a governor's race. But you have a poll that is 20% Hispanic respondents. So there's a 5% difference or a 5 percentage point difference. So pollsters will do what's called weighting, where they will add a little bit more weight to the Hispanics respondents because they are not fully, it's not a proportional representation in the sample. And how you weight things, it depends on the polling firm. They all have their own ways of doing it. There's not a specific correct way to do it, but sometimes you'll see that happen so that they can try to more accurately gauge what a demographic subgroup's opinions are about a candidate or a ballot measure. And then the last point about polling, we also often see what's called a likely voter, and that's a gauge of the likelihood that a poll respondent will vote. Just because a respondent answers the poll does not mean that they're actually going to vote. Now, problem is, there's no objective definition of who a likely voter is. Pollsters have their own formulas for how to determine it, but it's basically based on several data points that include, but are not necessarily limited to, that voter's previous voting history. If they vote in every single election that they can possibly vote for, they vote for presidential elections, they vote in midterms. There's odd year elections that they also participate in. They're probably going to show up for this election. Now, if it's somebody who only sporadically votes, they voted in the previous presidential election and they could have voted in the one before that, but didn't, then you might have a little bit of, I don't know if they're going to necessarily be a likely voter. Voters' responses on a poll question, if they seem like they're particularly energized and wanting to turn out for an election, you might consider them a likelier voter. And then you might put more weight on a demographic that is expected to see an increase in participation. For example, you might see potentially more black voters coming out because Kamala Harris is a black woman too. So you might consider them to be more likely voters depending on how they respond to a question. So it's not an exact science, but it is a way that we try to gauge who's actually going to come out to vote. Because if they're not going to come out to vote, you're probably not that concerned with what their opinion is because they can't help you. They can't hurt you, but they can't help you either. Next factor, the numbers and percentages of Democrats, Republicans, and other voters in a state or a district. So the partisan affiliation is the strongest indicator of how an individual votes. Regardless of what happens between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, regardless of anything that they say or do, most Democrats are going to vote Kamala Harris. He's a Democrat. Most Republicans are going to vote for Donald Trump because he's a Republican. Now, for some states, it's easier to track the party affiliation than others because 30 plus states track the affiliation of the voters. The other states just register their voters and then that's it. Now the parties also have their ways of if they make a lot of contact with certain voters, they may have them in their own databases as okay, this person's a Republican. Okay, this person's a Democrat. It's not necessarily an official designation, but parties sometimes in their databases of voter contacts, depending on their previous interactions with these voters or certain tells that they give, like if they have a bunch of bumper stickers that suggest that they're a Democrat or Republican, you might have them as that too. But for actual departments of elections for governments, they're not necessarily tracked for the party affiliation of these voters. Now, if the partisan lean for an electorate is heavy enough in a given contest, it's extremely difficult for the party with the disadvantage in numbers to win. An exception being Maryland is otherwise a very Democratic state, but Larry Hogan, a Republican, won the governorship in 2014 and 2018. Currently in Kansas, which is an otherwise Republican state, Laura Kelly, Democrat, has won the last two governor's races there. She's, at least at the time of this recording, at the time of the 2024 election, she is the incumbent governor in Kansas. So examples of states with a heavy partisan lean that do track their voters' party affiliation. On the Republican side, where there's a heavy plurality or majority, Idaho is a majority of Republicans. Wyoming is a huge majority of Republicans. There's over 80% that are registered with the Republican Party. The Dakotas, Utah, Oklahoma. If they're not a majority, they're at least a plurality where they're the largest subgroup. And then on the Democratic side, states that have a heavy plurality or majority. Maryland is a majority. California is a sizable population. It's not quite a majority, but it is a sizable population. And now independents actually make up more than Republicans in California. Delaware, New York. And then there's still a few states that have a plurality of independents. And then, of course, you have third parties. So there's relatively few people that register under a third party label, like Libertarian, Constitution, Green. And these third parties are not recognized as a ballot qualified party in every single state. So you're ballot qualified, meaning you're not going to see a candidate that is registered with that party in a state where that state does not recognize them as a ballot qualified party. Libertarian is the most common third party, but you'll see some states where libertarians are not recognized as ballot qualified. They might have them as you need a certain amount of support to qualify as a ballot qualified party, and that the criteria for how you do that it differs from state to state, and then sometimes there are different designations for independents depending on the state. Alaska has two categories known as nonpartisan and undeclared. Nonpartisan is what it sounds like, where you don't register with a party, but you specifically say, I'm not registering with a party. Undeclared is I'm registering to vote. I'm not even giving any indication of what way I lean. I'm not even going to say I'm nonpartisan. I'm just a voter, is basically what it means. And these independents are not necessarily swing voters either. Some independents actually vote more like quote unquote strong partisans. Strong just meaning that they often vote with the Republican Party or they often vote with the Democratic Party. But because of their independent nature, sometimes it's hard to determine how exactly they lean. So it might appear that they're swing voters. The group as a whole might be a swing bloc, but individual independents aren't necessarily swing voters, if that makes sense. Next factor, concurrent elections and candidates. So elections happening at the same time can help each other out or they can drag each other down. So there might be a prominent ballot measure bringing in more voters. Here in my state of Florida, the abortion ballot measurement is expected to bring in more voters and expected to favor the Democratic Party in that regard. We'll see if that actually happens. Candidate A's controversy might cause issues for candidate B in the same party, even if they're in a different race. For example, Donald Trump trying to win North Carolina. Right now, gubernatorial candidate Mark Robinson for Republicans is in a scandal. For some people, Mark Robinson is seen as a drag on Donald Trump, whereas in other races, Donald Trump might be seen as a drag on a gubernatorial candidate. Or on the flip side, Kamala Harris might be seen as a boon to a Democratic candidate, while for another Democratic candidate, it might drag them down. And then for some voters, they either reward or punish candidates of the same party up and down the ballot simply because they're the same party. So we talk about straight ticket voting versus split ticket voting. Straight ticket voting means you vote for one party on every partisan election that is on that ballot. You don't, unlike in a split tickets voting situation where one contest you vote for a Republican, next contest you might vote for a Democrat, next one you might vote Democrat, then another one you might vote Republican. For a lot of voters, they will just vote that same party throughout. And there are 7 states that allow a straight ticket voting option where you can just simply make one mark and it applies to every candidate in that party where you just fill in that mark and then, okay, we recognize that you're just going to vote for every Republican candidate on the ballot, but you're not going to fill in bubble for each individual one. Same thing with if they do a straight ticket voting option for Democrats. And then the final factor we'll go over is campaign strategies, current events, and party spending. Just going to kind of lob those together. So if the parties are pouring more money into a race, it's likely that the race is more competitive. I'm talking about if the Democratic Party itself pours more money into a race, or the Republican Party itself pours more money into the race. Of course, the individual candidates' campaigns are going to try to spend money, but the parties themselves or specific political groups might get involved too if they think that there is a reasonable chance that they're going to win. Now, it could be an incorrect estimation, and that party and their candidate still gets blown out, but that might not necessarily be the case. Same thing with independent expenditure committees, the super PACs that can bring in unlimited contributions and can spend unlimited amounts of money, but they can only do that if they don't coordinate with the campaigns that they're supporting. So if they're getting more heavily involved, it's likely that that contest is going to be more competitive. And then campaign strategies encompass a wide range of aspects like what methods they use to try to appeal to voters. So if they go use more TV versus radio versus mailers, it gets really nitty gritty and it's hard to make predictions on things like that, but that might come into play for a predictor or for a forecaster that's trying to make a prediction about that election, what geographical areas they go to. So if a presidential candidate doesn't go enough to a toss-up state and a forecaster thinks they should go to that, they might ding them a bit on the prediction and say, okay, this candidate is less likely to win this state, for example. And then what a campaign thinks the biggest issues are versus what the forecaster thinks the biggest issues are might not necessarily align. So if a candidate doesn't put enough emphasis on abortion and the forecaster thinks this is going to be a critical issue for that state, then they may say that candidate is less likely to win because they're not putting enough focus on abortion. And you can substitute abortion with any issue that you think is particularly important. Unemployment, for example, or just economy in general. And then obviously current events play a key role. They can make or break a candidate's chances in a close race. It's probably not going to impact a less competitive race enough to matter, but for a competitive race, it could mean everything. And that is going to do it for today's topic of how forecasters make their predictions about elections. Let's end it off with a random question, just like we always do. Today's random question is, if you could have an exotic animal as a pet that normally you'd legally not be allowed to have as a pet, what would you choose and why? For me, I don't know if you've ever seen them, but puffins up in Canada, they're adorable. I believe they also make cute noises. And I mean, just look up what a puffin looks like. It's adorable. So I'd love to have one of those as a pet. Obviously, not really normally allowed. If if there were no issues with it and it wasn't a hindrance to the puffin, I'd love to have one as a pet. So that is going to do it for today's episode. As always, thank you so much for tuning in, listening, and or watching. And you can follow me on Facebook at Paul Rader, author and speaker, LinkedIn, Medium. I'm also on my website, paulrader.org. Obviously, this podcast and my book, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Can Become More Competitive. Also on Amazon, available for purchase in ebook and paperback format. And I believe that is it. So, going to leave you off with that. Once again, thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, take care.